At 72, Margaret stood in her kitchen holding a teacup with both hands, listening to a house that had grown too quiet. It was the same home where she had raised children, buried a husband, and learned how to keep going. But that morning, the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt heavy. She had begun forgetting small things, growing uneasy at night, and dreading the thought no one would know if something went wrong. Her children whispered about a nursing home. Friends said it might be time. Margaret nodded politely, but deep down, something in her resisted. She did not need a hallway of strangers. She did not need to surrender her life. What she needed was simpler than that, and it changed everything. This video is for general educational and inspirational purposes only. Please reflect and consult professionals when applying life lessons. Margaret had always been the dependable one. The woman neighbors called when they needed a recipe, a ride, or a steady voice on the other end of the line. Even after turning 70, she still insisted she was fine. She paid her bills on time, kept the porch swept clean, and watered the same row of plants her husband had placed along the windowsill years ago. From the outside, everything looked manageable. But inside those walls, the truth was different. Small things had started to slip. She would forget whether she had eaten lunch. She would stand at the top of the stairs and hesitate, suddenly unsure of her footing. Some nights, she lay awake listening to the house settle and creak, wondering what she would do if she fell and no one came. The thought did not arrive with drama. It arrived quietly, the way most difficult truths do. Her children called often, but their concern had shifted. They asked more questions now. They lingered on the phone longer. Her oldest daughter, Carol, began suggesting things gently. Maybe a medical alert bracelet. Maybe someone to check in. Maybe it was time to consider other options. Margaret resisted at first. She had lived in that house for over 40 years. She had buried her husband from that front door. The idea of leaving felt like losing a part of herself she was not ready to let go of. But one evening, after a long call with Carol, she sat alone in the dim light of her living room and said the words she had been avoiding. "I do not think I should live alone anymore." The room stayed still after she said it. Not because the words were dramatic, but because they were true. And truth, at that age, carries a weight that cannot be. A week later, Margaret picked up the phone and called her longtime friend, June. They had known each other for over 30 years. They had raised children in the same neighborhood, attended the same church, and sat beside each other at more funerals than either wanted to count. June had lost her husband 5 years earlier and lived alone in a small apartment across town. Margaret suggested lunch, and June agreed without hesitation. They met at a quiet restaurant they had visited many times before. The conversation moved slowly at first. They talked about the weather, about grandchildren, about a neighbor who had recently moved away. But somewhere between the soup and the coffee, Margaret set down her cup and spoke more carefully. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what comes next." June listened without interrupting. "I cannot keep living the way I have been," Margaret continued. "But I am not ready for a nursing home. I do not want strangers deciding when I eat or when I sleep. I do not want to feel like I have already finished living." June nodded slowly. She understood. She had thought the same things herself on more nights than she would admit. Margaret looked at her and asked, almost shyly, "What would you think about us living together?" The question hung in the air for just a moment. June did not laugh. She did not look away. She simply leaned forward and said, "I was hoping you might ask." That was the turning point. Not a dramatic rescue. Not a last resort. Just two women who had lived long enough to recognize a wise decision when it appeared. They began talking about what it might look like. A shared space. Separate bedrooms. Their own routines, their own belongings, their own freedoms, but with the quiet comfort of. The change did not arrive with fanfare. There was no celebration, no announcement, no dramatic before and after. It came quietly, in small moments that added up over time. Margaret noticed it first in the mornings. She no longer woke with that familiar knot of unease in her chest. There was movement in the kitchen. The smell of coffee already made. A voice to say good morning to. These were not luxuries. They were lifelines she had not realized she needed until they were there. June noticed things Margaret had stopped seeing in herself. When she looked pale. When she seemed unusually quiet. When she had not eaten enough. It was not hovering or fussing. It was simply presence. The kind of attention that comes from someone who genuinely cares and has nowhere else to be. The evenings changed too. They no longer stretched out endlessly like something to survive. Instead, there was conversation. There were small routines. A television show they both enjoyed. A card game now and then. The kind of ordinary moments that only feel precious once you have lived without them. Her children saw the difference almost immediately. Carol called one Sunday and later told her brother that their mother sounded lighter. More like herself. More present in the conversation instead of drifting somewhere else. Margaret felt it too, though she struggled to put it into words. What had changed most was not her address. It was something deeper. It was her dignity. She had not been pushed into the next chapter of her life by fear or crisis. She had stepped into it on her own terms, beside someone she trusted. For many adults over 50, that may be the part that matters most. Not simply where you live, but whether your life still feels like it belongs to. Margaret and June were not perfect housemates. No two people who have lived 7 decades on their own terms ever are. June liked the television too loud. She watched the evening news at a volume that made Margaret wince from the other room. Margaret woke early each morning and moved through the kitchen with purpose, opening cabinets and running water while June was still trying to hold on to sleep. They had different ideas about how a refrigerator should be organized. They disagreed about when windows should be opened. June preferred the house warm. Margaret liked the cool air. Small habits rubbed against each other in ways neither had anticipated. But those little frictions were a small price for peace. What made it work was something neither of them talked about directly. It was respect. They had both lived long enough to know when something mattered and when it did not. A loud television was not worth an argument. An early morning noise was not a personal insult. They learned to laugh at themselves and let the small things go. Over time, they made the place their own. 2 mugs sat by the sink each night. 2 coats hung by the door. 2 chairs faced the window where the afternoon light came through. The house began to hold the shape of both their lives. Margaret once told her daughter during a phone call, "I thought asking for help meant losing my life. I thought it meant admitting I could not manage anymore. But this gave me some of it back. Maybe even more than I had before." She paused and added, "I wish I had not waited so long to consider it." Pride can sound noble. Independence can feel like strength. But Margaret and June had both lived long enough to know that holding on too tightly sometimes makes life harder than it. So this is the heart of the story. Not a miracle. Not a dramatic rescue. Just a quiet decision made by a woman who refused to let fear choose for her. Margaret did not end up in a nursing home. She did not spend her remaining years surrounded by strangers in a place that never quite felt like her own. Instead, she found something simpler and more sustaining. A shared life with someone she trusted. A home where she could still be herself while no longer carrying the weight of each day alone. It was not a perfect solution. No solution ever is. But it was the right one for her. What Margaret discovered was that independence does not always mean doing everything yourself. Sometimes it means making choices that protect your dignity while accepting that circumstances have changed. It means recognizing that needing people is not the same as losing yourself. It means understanding that asking for companionship is not surrender. It is wisdom. Too often, adults over 70 believe there are only 2 options. Stay alone and struggle quietly, or give up everything and move into a facility. Margaret found a third path. She reached out to someone she knew and created a living situation that honored both her need for support and her desire for autonomy. Her story is not unusual. Across the country, older adults are discovering that shared housing with friends, siblings, or trusted companions can offer stability without sacrifice. It requires honesty. It requires flexibility. It requires the humility to admit that the way things were is not the way things need to remain. Margaret often thinks about the morning she finally said the words aloud. The morning she admitted she could not continue as before. She expected to feel defeated. Instead, she felt something closer to relief. And that relief opened a door she had not known was. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and share your reflection with us here at The Quiet Start. What does living well look like in the later chapters of life?